The national heat-related death toll from this summer's pattern is already at least 40, and it is still climbing. That number alone would be the headline in most years. But it is not even the top story this week, because the same ridge of high pressure that has already killed at least 40 people set an all-time temperature record in a city that has been keeping records for 152 years and burned through more than 100,000 acres in Colorado is not finished. It rebuilt itself for a third time in the last 3 weeks, and it is now sitting directly over the northern plains, spreading southeast with no clean exit in sight until the back half of the month at the earliest. If you live anywhere between the Rockies and the Mississippi River, or anywhere the smoke and the heat have been drifting toward over the last several days, subscribe before this video ends, because this pattern has already proven it does not go quietly, and you are going to want the next update before the next surge arrives. Before we get into where the heat is going and how bad it gets, you need to understand why this particular pattern refuses to leave. This is not a normal midsummer hot spell that builds for a couple of days and breaks. This is what meteorologists call an omega block, named because the shape of the jet stream, when you look at it on a map, bends into something that resembles the Greek letter omega, a tall ridge of high pressure flanked by troughs digging down on either side. That shape is structurally stable in a way that an ordinary ridge is not. A normal heat dome gets nudged along by the jet stream after a few days and moves off to make room for the next system. An omega block resists that push. The ridge locks itself into position, and the troughs on either side act almost like retaining walls, holding the high pressure in place instead of letting it slide east. That is the mechanical reason this heat wave has now built, broken, and rebuilt 3 separate times since late June instead of behaving like a single event that comes and goes. Here is how that has played out on the ground so far. Because the history matters for understanding why forecasters are taking the current surge so seriously. The first version of this heat dome built over the central United States in the final days of June, ahead of the 4th of July holiday, and it delivered the most widespread 90-degree heat the country had seen all year. By the end of June, the worst of it was sitting over the Midwest, the Great Lakes, and the Ohio Valley, where Chicago logged heat index values near 110 degrees, and Detroit flirted with triple digits for the first time in more than a decade. Within days, the heat shifted east into the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, and that is when the numbers started setting records instead of just approaching them. Central Park hit 100 degrees, its first triple-digit day since 2012, and a tie with a daily record that had stood since 1966. Overnight temperatures at LaGuardia never dropped below 94 degrees at midnight, the hottest midnight reading ever logged there. Washington, D.C. crossed the 100-degree mark the same day and strained the power grid doing it. Then, on the 4th of July itself, the pattern broke violently rather than gently, with more than 540 damaging wind reports streaming from the plains into the Northeast in a single day, and a wind gust of 92 miles an hour recorded in Norman, Oklahoma. Fireworks shows across the region were canceled outright. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the ridge pivoted west, parked itself over the Southwest and the Rockies, and gave Denver what forecasters at the time called a potentially historic stretch of consecutive days above 100 degrees. Then it rebuilt for a second time in mid-July, and this is where the numbers start to look less like a normal summer and more like something forecasters will be studying afterward. On July 12th, Billings, Montana reached 111 degrees. Salt Lake City reached 109 degrees the same day. Both of those were all time record highs, not records for the date, not records. For July, the hottest temperatures ever officially recorded in either city, in Salt Lake City's case across 152 years of weather records. Within 2 days, more than 125 million Americans were under some form of heat alert simultaneously, coast to coast. Smoke from more than 800 active wildfires burning across Canada was drifting south into the upper Midwest and the Northeast at the same time, layering degraded air quality on top of the heat itself for anyone with asthma, COPD, or any other respiratory vulnerability. And now we are in round 3. As of this week, the dome's next surge is already underway. The Weather Prediction Center has flagged major heat risk running from the northern plains southeast into the lower Missouri and lower Mississippi valleys, with the most intense stretch expected to hold through the 21st of the month. Forecast highs across that corridor are running from the mid-90s into the low 100s, which sounds almost restrained compared to the round that produced Billings and Salt Lake City's records. But the geography matters here. This surge is centered further south and east, over more densely populated corridors along the lower Missouri and Mississippi River valleys, which means the raw number of people inside the highest risk zone is larger, even if the peak temperature itself is a few degrees lower than the previous round. The one piece of relatively good news is that the upper Midwest edge of this surge is trending milder than earlier forecasts suggested. with Minneapolis expected around 91 to 93 degrees before a round of storms knocks highs back into the low 80s by the middle of next week. That is a real cool down for one city on the northern edge of the pattern. It is not a sign the broader pattern is breaking down. The reason forecasters keep using the word dangerous rather than simply hot comes down to what happens when you combine high temperatures with high humidity and, just as importantly, with warm nights. The heat index, which measures how hot the air actually feels to the human body once humidity is factored in, is forecast to approach 110 degrees across the Mid-South and the Gulf Coast during this stretch, where dew points run highest. But the more dangerous number in a lot of these events is not the daytime peak at all, it is the overnight low. When overnight temperatures stay in the high 70s or low 80s instead of dropping into a range the human body can actually recover in, something changes physiologically. Normally a hot day is survivable, in part because the body gets a break overnight, core temperature comes back down, cardiovascular stress eases, and the person starts the next day from a normal baseline. When the overnight low will not drop far enough for that recovery to happen, the thermal stress from one day compounds directly onto the thermal stress from the day before and the day after that, without a reset in between. That cumulative loading is why heat waves that stretch across many consecutive days are so much more lethal than a single hot afternoon, even when the single hottest afternoon in the stretch is not the record breaker. Forecasters are specifically warning that this event carries the possibility of record high minimum temperatures in parts of the affected region, which is a technical way of saying the nights are not going to give anyone a break. The human toll from this pattern is not hypothetical or still being modeled. It is already documented, and it is still being counted. New Jersey alone has officially confirmed 22 heat-related deaths over a single holiday weekend earlier in this sequence. Additional confirmed deaths have come out of New York, Philadelphia, and Illinois. And officials investigating these cases have been consistent in saying publicly that heat deaths are almost always undercounted in the initial tally, because many of them get attributed to underlying cardiac or respiratory causes rather than to the heat that triggered them, and only get reclassified after a fuller review. The people who show up in these numbers are rarely the ones you picture sweating it out on a hiking trail. They are far more often elderly residents living in homes without reliable air conditioning, outdoor laborers, and agricultural workers who cannot simply stop working because the heat index crossed a threshold, people experiencing homelessness with no access to a cooled space at all, and people with underlying heart or lung conditions that make it harder for the body to regulate its own temperature under sustained thermal stress. A large-scale, multi-week heat event spread across a huge swath of the country is not one dramatic emergency. It is thousands of smaller, quieter emergencies happening in bedrooms and apartments and outdoor job sites, most of which never make a headline individually. There's also a compounding infrastructure risk that runs alongside the health risk, and it deserves attention because it can turn a survivable heat event into a genuinely dangerous one very quickly. When tens of millions of people across a wide region are running air conditioning at close to maximum capacity simultaneously, electrical grids come under strain that they are not always built to absorb without incident. Washington, D.C.'s grid was already reported as strained during the record peak in early July. A wide-scale power outage during a heat event of this magnitude is one of the more dangerous failure points in the entire system because it removes the primary protection that most heat-vulnerable people actually rely on, and it does so at the exact moment demand for that protection is highest. Emergency management officials in the affected states have been monitoring grid stress as an active part of this event, rather than a side concern. Now to the wildfire dimension, because in Colorado, this heat pattern has not just been uncomfortable, it has been directly destructive. The same bridge of high pressure that has been baking the interior west has also been drying out fuels and setting up exactly the conditions large fires need to spread. The Aspen Acres fire in Pueblo and Custer counties has grown past 100,000 acres, making it the seventh largest wildfire in Colorado's recorded history, and at its peak it destroyed more than 850 structures, including at least 337 homes. 3 firefighters have died battling the broader fire complex in the state. There is genuinely encouraging news on this front this week. Containment on Aspen Acres has jumped from under 50% to 61% in the span of a few days. The Ferris fire is now 83% contained. Evacuation orders around the fire zone are easing. More than 1,300 animals that were sheltered at the state fairgrounds during the evacuations are being returned home, and a recovery assistance center is opening in Beulah for residents who lost property. That is real progress, and it matters. But it is progress happening inside an active heat and drought pattern that is still ongoing, which means the underlying fire risk across the interior west remains elevated even as individual fires get brought under control. The one force actually working against this heat dome right now is the North American monsoon. Monsoon moisture has begun spreading across the southwest and the Great Basin, and it is chipping away at the western flank of the ridge. which is the mechanism forecasters expect will eventually break this pattern down for good. That word eventually is doing real work in that sentence. AccuWeather's current outlook is that the dome could persist over the plains through much of the remainder of July before the monsoon surge finally wins out. That is not a forecast for relief this week, or even necessarily next week. It is a forecast that the pattern has a known expiration mechanism, but that the mechanism has not finished its job yet. And until it does, the ridge over the central United States is going to keep doing what it has done 3 times now, which is rebuild rather than dissipate. It's worth taking a moment to explain why this particular ridge has been so resistant to breaking down the normal way, because the physics connects directly to why the heat keeps coming back, rather than simply fading out after the first surge. A ridge of high pressure works by pushing air downward through the atmosphere. As that air sinks, it compresses, and compressing air warms up. The same basic principle that makes a bicycle pump warm to the touch after you use it. That sinking, warming air suppresses cloud formation, because clouds need rising, cooling air to form. Without clouds to reflect sunlight back to space, and without rainfall to cool the surface through evaporation, the ground underneath the ridge just keeps absorbing solar energy day after day, with nothing to interrupt the buildup. That is the feedback loop that turns an ordinary warm ridge into a record-breaking heat dome. It also happens to be a feedback loop that dries out soil and vegetation, which is exactly the fuel condition that let a fire like Aspen Acres grow to the 7th largest in state history once an ignition source was present. An omega block adds a second layer on top of that basic heat dome mechanism, which is the shape of the surrounding jet stream itself. When troughs dig down on both sides of a ridge in that omega configuration, they do not just fail to push the ridge along, they actively reinforce it, because the counter-rotating flow around each trough helps sustain the high pressure sitting between them. That is the structural reason this pattern has now rebuilt 3 separate times over roughly 3 weeks instead of behaving like a normal heat wave that peaks and exits within about a week. Each time it looked like the ridge was finally breaking down, whether after the violent July 4th storm line or after the brief lull in mid-month, it reformed almost exactly where the previous version had sat, over the Great Basin and the northern and central plains, before pushing its heat outward again. So where does that leave the outlook for the coming days specifically? The Weather Prediction Center's major heat risk designation currently covers the stretch from the northern plains down through the lower Missouri and lower Mississippi valleys, running through the 21st of the month, with highs in the mid-90s to low 100s across that corridor. The upper Midwest, specifically the area around Minneapolis, gets a partial reprieve as a round of storms pushes through and knocks temperatures back into the low 80s by the middle of next week, though that relief is regional and temporary rather than a sign the broader ridge is collapsing. Meanwhile, the fire recovery. Picture in Colorado continues to improve, with containment numbers climbing across the state's major fires, and evacuation orders easing, even as the drought conditions that allowed those fires to grow so large in the first place remain a function of the same heat pattern that is still sitting over the region. And running underneath all of it is the monsoon, spreading moisture across the southwest and the Great Basin, working against the western edge of the ridge, but not yet strong enough or far enough north to be the thing that finally ends this. What happens after the current Plains and Mississippi Valley surge eases around the 21st is the open question, and it is genuinely open rather than settled. If the monsoon moisture continues to build and pushes far enough north and east over the coming days, it can undercut the ridge's ability to sustain itself the same way monsoon surges have broken down heat domes over the interior west in past summers. If it does not build quickly enough, or if the jet stream configuration around the ridge stays locked in its current omega shape, and the pattern has already demonstrated 3 separate times this summer that its default behavior is to rebuild rather than dissipate. Forecasters are watching the same signals they have been watching all month, the strength and northward progress of monsoon moisture across the southwest, and whether the jet stream troughs flanking the ridge weaken enough to let it finally get pushed east and broken apart the normal way. There is one more thread worth pulling on here, because it explains why this summer's version of the pattern has felt different from a typical hot July, even to people who live through heat waves every year. Meteorologists have been watching El Nino conditions develop through the spring and into summer, with some forecasters flagging the possibility of what gets called a super El Nino as the year goes on. El Nino years tend to load the dice toward exactly this kind of outcome: more persistent ridging, higher odds of prolonged heat events, and a jet stream that is more prone to getting stuck in blocked configurations, like the omega pattern currently sitting over the country. None of that means any single heat wave is caused by El Nino on its own. The atmosphere is far too complicated for one factor to explain one event. But it does help explain why forecasters were flagging an unusually active and unusually hot summer months in advance, and why a pattern that rebuilds itself 3 times in 3 weeks is consistent with what a lot of seasonal outlooks were already pointing toward before any of this began. It is also worth noting that this has not been a uniquely American story this summer. Europe has been dealing with its own version of the same phenomenon at close to the same time, an omega block heat dome that shattered June records across Spain, France, and the United Kingdom, and has been linked to deaths of its own. Seeing two major heat domes locked in place on opposite sides of the Atlantic in the same stretch of summer is unusual, and it is the kind of pattern that atmospheric scientists are watching closely. Not because any single event proves a broader trend on its own, but because the frequency and persistence of these blocked patterns is exactly what a warming climate is expected to make more common over time. In the meantime, the practical guidance has not changed since the first version of this heat dome built over the country in late June, and it is worth repeating precisely because the pattern has proven itself repetitive rather than a one-time event. Drink water before you feel thirsty, not after, because thirst is already a lagging indicator of dehydration. Avoid strenuous outdoor activity during the hottest hours of the afternoon, whenever that is a choice you actually have. Check on elderly neighbors, young children, and anyone you know without reliable air conditioning, because those are consistently the people who end up in the mortality numbers weeks after everyone else has stopped thinking about the heat wave. Never leave a child or pet in a parked car, even for what feels like a short errand, because vehicle interior temperatures climb far faster than most people expect. And know the warning signs before you need them. Heat exhaustion looks like heavy sweating, dizziness, and nausea. Heat stroke looks like confusion, hot, dry skin, and a body temperature above 100 and 3 degrees, and it is a medical emergency that requires immediate cooling and immediate medical attention, not a wait-and-see approach. This has now been 3 rounds in 3 weeks from a single locked atmospheric pattern that keeps proving forecasters right every time they warn it is going to come back. It set an all-time temperature record in a city with a century and a half of weather. History behind it. It has been directly tied to a death toll that officials openly say is still being undercounted. It fed a wildfire that is now the 7th largest in Colorado's recorded history. And as of this week, it is back over the plains, spreading southeast with the only real counterforce, the monsoon, still working, but not yet finished. If you're anywhere inside the current risk zone or anywhere this pattern has already reached once this summer, stay with this channel, because a pattern with this track record has already earned the benefit of the doubt that it is not done. Drop your city in the comments and let us know what the heat has actually looked like where you are. Subscribe now so you get the update the moment the next surge or the next break in the pattern is confirmed, and take the same precautions today that you would have taken the last 2 times this ridge built, because the ridge itself has made clear it plans to keep coming back until the monsoon finally wins.